If you've ever struggled to make your own homemade pie crust, I'm gonna show you a super easy technique. You only need a mixing bowl and a fork or a pastry cutter. Welcome to the Salted Pepper, where we cook for real life using real food and we keep it real simple. And today I'm gonna show you how to make a super easy and delicious flaky pie dough. Then we're gonna turn that into a beautiful pie crust that we blind bake in the Ninja Foodi. First, let me start off by saying that this is not the only way to make a pie crust, but it is the way that I have found to be the most consistent and give you a delicious, buttery, flaky pie crust. So you can make a pie crust in the Ninja Foodi Hot Cold Blender, for example. I have done that before using the pulse button. You can also make it in a food processor using the pulse button. But what I find when you use appliances to make the pie crust is you overestimate the amount of liquid needed and you end up overworking the gluten, and that results in a tough pie crust. So I'm gonna show you how I make my pie crust. Super easy to do. We start off with 2 cups of flour. Now, this is based on having a recipe for 2 pie crust that will fit in my 9-inch Fat Daddy-O pan, because I'm gonna turn the pie crust into a couple of different pies and I'm gonna bake them in the Ninja Foodi. So this is the amount of ingredients that will make 2 pie crusts for this 9-inch Fat Daddy-O pie pan. If your pie pans are a little bit bigger, you might want to increase the ingredients like to 2.5 cups of flour. Then you would also need to increase your butter a little bit, but I'll go over that in the written post. I'll give you some guidelines of how to do that. All right, so to the 2 cups of flour, which is just all-purpose flour, and I did not sift it, although you could if you wanted to. 1 tablespoon of sugar. Now, I only use the sugar if I'm doing a sweet pie. If I'm doing something savory, like chicken pot pie or something like that, then I would not add the sugar in. We want to put in 1 teaspoon of salt. Believe it or not, that's very important for the overall flavor. And then we get in our butter. So I'm just going to, real quick, just sort of blend this up a little bit. Using 1.5 sticks of very, very cold salted butter. Now you can use unsalted, that won't make any difference, but I always have salted here. And I cut them into about teaspoon sections and I just throw them right into the flour. If you wanted to use a fork to do this because you didn't have a pastry cutter, you may want to grate your butter ahead of time and then pop it in the freezer. It's going to make it a little bit easier for you to get the size pebbles that you want with a fork. And I'll show you that. I'll grab a fork and show you how that works, just in case you don't have one of these. All right, so that's 1.5 sticks. Which is 3/4 of a cup of butter. All right, now let me grab a fork and I'm gonna show you that first, and then we're gonna get into using my pastry cutter because it makes it so much easier to make the pie crust. If you only have a fork, you can certainly do it, but again, I recommend you grating your butter onto a plate and then putting it into the freezer for a few minutes to get it really hard because it's gonna make it easier. So if you did it this way and you have a fork, you have to actually mash the butter up. And it can be a little bit hard to do because you are working with very cold butter. So that's why I cut mine into these size pieces, because I have this handy dandy thing and it just goes right through it. So now I'm just gonna cut through the butter and cut it into the flour, moving around the bowl. And I will scrape this off. The one thing that I do not do is touch the butter or touch the flour with my hands, because the warmth of your hands will start to melt the butter. We need cold butter in our flour before we bake the pie, or else you're gonna end up not having a very flaky pie crust. It's gonna be denser. The butter in the pie crust gives off steam, makes little pockets, and that's why you get a nice flaky, fluffy, it's not really fluffy, is it? But flaky pie crust. All right, so this takes probably about, I don't know, 3 minutes or so. And then I'll show you the size of the pebbles you want. All right, that looks good. Now I'm just gonna make sure I get all the butter out of my pastry cutter. Just kind of move it around. Make sure we got all the big pieces of butter cut up, and it looks like we do. All right, so now let me show you about the size of the pieces of butter, okay? So they are just like a little tiny stone. All right, now I'm using all butter for this pie crust. That's what I prefer, but you can use, you know, a Crisco and butter mix if you want, which is the solid shortening. You can do that, that's fine. I just like the all butter. All right, now the next thing we need to do is add some moisture to this. You want your water to be very cold. So I put about a cup or so of water and then about 4 or 5 ice cubes and just set it to the side and let it get really, really cold. Now, this is the thing. It's impossible for me to tell you how many tablespoons of water to put into your flour mixture because it's going to vary, and this is the key to making a delicious pie crust. You want just enough moisture, but not too much. In fact, your pie crust is gonna be a little crumbly before we refrigerate it. So let me show you. So I start off with about 2 or 3 because I know I'm gonna need that much. And just go right around the edges here. And then get one in the middle. There we go. That is. And then just take a spatula or a spoon or something and then just toss it around. Now, we don't want to overwork this, so we don't want to put it out on our flat surface. We don't want to knead it, nothing like that, because number one, kneading it will melt the butter, which you don't want, and also we don't want to activate the gluten in the flour. So we want to treat this with kid gloves. You'll see the pieces start to get bigger and bigger as it combines with the water. So we are up to 3 tablespoons, and we still need some more. I'm gonna stop at 5. And if you've never made pie crust before, stop at 4, add 1 tablespoon at a time after those initial 3. All right, so we are almost there, but not quite. Okay, so that's 6. Usually it's somewhere between 6 and 8 is what I've found. And that varies based on the humidity in your house, because if it's very dry and your flour's very dry, you will need a little bit more liquid. If your flour's, you know, kind of a little moister, I know it sounds kind of funny, but humidity really does affect the flour a lot. All right, that looks really good. I think we could use 1 more, so I'm gonna go ahead. And a way that you can test for that is pick up some, and I know, you know, don't do this too often, but this is a way to test. Pick it up and squeeze it, and actually, that is pretty good. But see how it's a little bit crumbly there? I'm gonna go ahead with 1 more tablespoon of water, and I think that's gonna be it. So that would have been 8. I made this recipe yesterday, and it was also 8. But sometimes it might be 9, sometimes it might be 7. All right, I think that's pretty good now. Might even need 1 more, but I'm not gonna do that right now. I can add a little bit more if I want to. All right, now we wanna get some plastic wrap. I'm gonna dump it right onto the plastic wrap. This is when I'll make a decision, because I'll get the parts from the bottom that are out, and I'm gonna see if it is too, if it still needs a little bit more water, if it's too dry. don't think it is though. All right, now I'm gonna fold up the plastic wrap here. And I'm just gonna press down. Now I wanna see, will this come together? And because I have the plastic wrap there, I'm not using a whole lot of the heat from my hands. And I think we're gonna be good here, honestly. All right, it looks pretty good, but you know, I see it cracking just a little bit, so I am gonna go ahead and add 1 more tablespoon of the water in there. And then we will get it divided in half and we'll get it into the plastic wrap and then into the fridge. Sometimes I do it while it's right on the plastic wrap too, but I decided I would put it back in the bowl. But this is looking really good. All right, so let's get half of it out. Now, if you want to be really particular, you can weigh it, but I don't usually do that. That looks about right. Move that out of the way so you can see. All right, so now we've got a crumbly mess, right? It doesn't even look like a pie crust, but don't worry about it. Just shape it into a little disc. You can even pick it up. Try not to overwork it though. You'll be amazed what happens in the refrigerator. All right, now wrap it back up really well. Just kind of squeeze it together. And put it in the refrigerator for at least 30 minutes, but you could actually put this in the refrigerator overnight, and you can make pie crust up ahead of time and pop them in the freezer until you want to use them, so that's no problem. All right, I'm gonna do the same thing for the next one, and then I'll get them in the refrigerator for 30 minutes, and then we are going to blind bake a pie crust in the Ninja Foodi. So I let my pie crust stay in the plastic wrap overnight in the refrigerator. But you don't have to wait overnight. 30 minutes is good enough, but I was busy doing something else, so I waited overnight. Now I've let it sit out at room temperature for a few minutes just to make it easier to roll out. So it's probably been sitting here for about 10 minutes. One thing that I wanted to show you is the butter. You can actually see the pieces of butter in the dough, and that's what we want. So that is a sign of a really good pie dough that's going to result in a flaky, buttery pie crust. So I'm gonna roll it out now and get it into our pan because we're gonna blind bake it. And blind baking is really good for making recipes that require the filling to not be baked, okay? So you prepare the pie shell just like you would get at the store already done, but it's homemade. And you do that by blind baking it. The other reason why I blind bake my pie crust, even if I'm going to cook them, like for apple pie, if I have a crumb coating on top and I am gonna cook that for a while, it's because it gets the bottom really nice and crispy, so it's less soggy. Now, I'm not saying it's perfectly crisp because once you add moisture to it, it does, you know, soften up some, but it is not nearly as soggy as it is if you just put your wet filling into a raw pie crust. All right, so I'm just gonna spread some flour around here, and we're gonna go all the way out to 12 inches. We wanna make a circle for our pie crust. Even though the pan is 9 inches, we want that extra so that we can make the design on the top of the crust. All right, so let's get this out right in the center here. And I sprinkle a little bit on top because you don't want your rolling pin to stick to the butter and pull out of the dough. And then I just gently start going back and forth in this kind of a motion. It's gonna be stiff, okay, because it's really cold, but that's what we want. And I just do it very gently. And then once I get it a little bit into around, I guess this is probably about 6 inches or so, then I lift it up and put a little bit more flour down and turn it over. And you can see here that there's some edges that aren't looking all beautiful. Don't worry about that. They're gonna work themselves out and they'll be on the outside and we won't have any issues. Let's put just a little bit on top here. So very slowly. And I'm working from the center out. So I don't do long motions like this, I like to work it from the center out so I have a little more control over this edge here, because I want to get this one out further so we don't have that on our pie crust when we go to do the decorations. All right, now I'm to about 10 inches, and I'm gonna flip it again. Comes up really nice, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more flour here. That looks good there. Oops, I just grabbed it with my thumbnail, grabbed it. It's okay. You always want to make your pie crust much bigger than you actually need so that you can form it perfectly. And I'm getting a little bit stuck here, so that means I just need to sprinkle a little bit more flour. But this is looking really good. So I went a little bit past the 12 inches, and I am not in a perfect circle. No worries about that at all. Okay, now I'm gonna just sort of gently lift up here, see if there's anything sticking. I kind of rub some flour, rub a little flour here. And I try not to handle this dough very much because we don't want the butter to melt until we get it into our pie crust. So then I just fold it back like that, take the pie pan and gently lift it up, fold it over, and now we have our pie dough in the pan, and I just lift up gently. Now, if this takes you longer than it took me, which was just a few minutes, you might want to put this back in the refrigerator right now before you go on to the next step. And I may do that. I'll see how long it takes me. I'm not like a perfect pie decorator or anything like that. All right, so once it is inside the dish and kind of pressed down, then we're going to trim it up and make our decorations. All right, so to do that, let me grab a knife, and we're gonna cut off some of the excess, and then we're gonna make a nice little scallop looking edge. And okay, so this is a little short here, but I've got a lot of extra over here. If you notice that, it's perfectly fine to move it a little bit and just kind of move it around so that you have at least an inch or so on each side. Probably 1.5 inches is good. I might have moved it a little too far that time. So it's all right. It's all good. Okay, so now I'm gonna use this as a guide. That's gonna give me a good amount of crust to work with to make a nice scallop edge, and that is about 2 inches. But I don't want all this excess over here, so I'm just gonna cut it off. I don't throw it away though, because if you need to make any kind of changes like to the crust, like if you run into a thin spot, you can always fix it with this extra pie dough. Or you can roll it in cinnamon sugar and air fry it and have a little treat afterwards. All right, so once your pie is trimmed up, make sure it's in here pretty good, like that. I just lift this up, make sure it's really sitting there on the bottom. Gently run your finger across. Okay, now we're gonna make our edge. So to make our edge, we're gonna fold this over like this, okay? And just let it kind of sit there for now. Keep folding and let it sit on the rim. Now some rims are bigger. This one has a very low profile rim, and that's because it fits in the Ninja Foodi, and that's why it fits in the Ninja Foodi. So yours might be a little bit different, but just fold this over to make your little edge here. And then there's several ways you can decorate. I mean, you can just press down with a fork right now and make that kind of a design if you don't want to be bothered with what I'm about to do, which is make a scalloped edge. All right, so now I'm gonna make the scalloped edge, and it's really easy. I use my first finger and my middle finger on this side and my first finger on this side, and I go in and just crimp it. Pull back out, go in and crimp again, and keep moving across the pie. If you feel like you're sticking, you can put some flour on your hands. That works fine. Like that, I just got stuck a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of flour. Also, if you're running into a lot of trouble doing this, you can pop your pie crust back in the refrigerator. That's going to help, but I'm just going to keep going. I think I'm going to be able to do it just fine. All right, that looks pretty good. So that is our pie crust. Now I'm gonna pop it into the refrigerator for just about 5 to 10 minutes. Meanwhile, I'm gonna start to preheat the Ninja Foodi. We're gonna do that on bake roast, and we're gonna take the temperature down to 300 degrees and hit the start button. So I'm gonna chill this for a few minutes, then we're gonna get our beans in there, and we're gonna get to blind baking. All right, so I've had the Ninja Foodi preheating for over 10 minutes now. 10 minutes is fine though, and I've had the pie chilling for 10 minutes. Now, blind baking requires us to weight down the pie. If we just threw this on the rack and threw it into the Ninja Foodi, all of these sides would just collapse down on each other as they started to cook. You would end up with a complete mess. So we have to weight it, and we do that with either pie weights or beans. And a liner. Now, I know a lot of people do not like aluminum foil to touch their food. You can do this with parchment. I prefer doing it with aluminum foil. And I just take a sheet of aluminum foil and start to press it in to the pie crust, making sure I get all the way up to the edges. This is why it's a little easier, I think, with aluminum foil, because I can take it all the way up and make sure I've got a nice fit in there. The parchment does work though. I have tried it that way. It just doesn't fit as well, but it does work. Okay. So I'm going to do that all the way around the pie crust, and that's why we need it to be chilled before we do this part, because if not, you would end up messing up your pie. So it needs to be a little bit on the firm side. Any extra, I just fold in. We do want these edges to be exposed for this because we want them to get nice and brown. And you can control how brown they get because you can just par bake this way too. So if you're gonna end up putting it back in, you can always just par bake. All right, so pie weights. They come in ceramic pie weights that you just, pile in there, or they come in strings. But I think I bought 2 strings of these. No, maybe it's just 1. I should have bought 2. Anyway, once I put these in, they don't even hardly cover the bottom. And so it just seemed wasteful for me to buy so many of these when I have tons of beans and you can reuse these over and over. So I use about 2 pounds of beans. And these are just little red beans that I have, but you could use black beans, kidney beans, any kind of beans that you have. Now you can't eat these afterwards, and you wouldn't want to. But you can reuse them for baking. I will warn you though, they will have an aroma as they're baking. These have been used probably at least 3 times. So now I'm gonna push it up against the edges. That's where I really want it weighted down more than anything. And I might actually grab a few more beans here and pop them in the middle. So I'm gonna do that real quick, and then we're gonna get this to bake at 300 degrees for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will remove this and bake the bottom layer, the bottom of the crust. All right, there we go. So I just added some more red beans just to make it all the way up to the top so I know it's nicely weighted down. Now I'm gonna put this on the rack. And it doesn't matter that the Ninja Foodi just turned off. It's still going to be hot enough. And we're going to lower it in. Close the lid. Select the bake. Take it back down to 300. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And hit start. And let's take it up to 20 minutes, but we will be checking on it at about 10, 15 minutes, and I'll make a determination whether it's time to come out or not. All right, so let me talk about why we're doing this under a low temperature instead of a high temperature. Because usually we bake pie crust at a super high temperature. And you can do that. You can do that in the Ninja Foodi. But what I found is by really lowering that temperature, even lower than what we would do in the oven, because in the oven 300 would be about 350, and I would think that you would blind bake in the oven at about 400 degrees, even 425 maybe. But what I found is by taking the temperature down even lower, we control the amount of browning, and it cooks slowly but perfectly. And I didn't have any dripping of edges here and there like I did when I tried a higher temperature. It seemed like the higher temperature melted the butter in places and caused the shrinkage of the crust, whereas when I went lower for a longer period of time, it did not do that. So I ended up with a better looking pie crust. And these blind baked pie crusts are fantastic, like for making quiches too. So this is a great recipe to make up. You can even make them up ahead of time and pop them in the freezer and then get one out when you're ready to bake up your quiche or make your no-bake pie filling. All right, so it's been about 10 minutes and we're gonna go ahead and check to see if the edges have set up enough so that if we remove the beans, the pie crust won't start to slide in. Now, ordinarily, I would just do this right in the pot, but for you guys, oh, I just burned myself. For you guys, I'm gonna bring it out so I can show you what I mean. All right, so what I do here is just sort of like feel it, and I'm gonna put this down so we don't lose all of our heat in there. And I just kind of pull this away and just see, is it done enough? I want to go 5 more minutes with the beans in. It feels like it's almost set up, but not quite enough. So let's go 5 more minutes, and then we'll get the beans out and we will finish baking our crust. Now I know this seems like it's, you know, a lot of work, but let me tell you, it really makes a great pie crust. And even if you're gonna bake the pie crust afterwards, it really does, I don't know, just add something really special to the pie. I'm gonna take the time down so it'll beat me when we're ready. All right, I'm gonna let this go ahead and go through the little cool down and then open up the lid and pull it out. All right, then I just kind of lower it down here like this. Now, by the time you get it out, the foil will cool down pretty quick, but just test it and make sure. Then we're gonna lift it out, and I'm gonna open up these edges that I folded under so that I have more of a handle to use. Gather it up and lift it out. Now, very important, before you store your beans, like put them in a bag or a container, you want to let them cool completely. Don't put them in when they're hot or they'll have some condensation and then they will grow mold. Let them cool 100% until they are completely room temperature again, and then you can bag them up and use them again. All right, now I'm gonna prick the bottom, and that is just gonna put tiny little holes in to allow some airflow so that we don't have a big puffy crust on the bottom. I have done this sometimes and not done it other times, and I have noticed a little bit of a difference. Now, some people are worried about poking the crust and then ending up with holes, but they fill back in as the pie bakes, and it just helps to release some of the steam so that we get a nice even flat bottom and not little raised areas. But even when you do this and you do everything right, sometimes you'll get some raised areas. I don't want you to worry about them, okay? All right, so let's see, can I tilt this? I'm gonna really be testing fate here. I want you to see the inside. So you can see that the edges are cooked, but the inside is still completely raw. So no matter how long you cooked it with the beans in, you're never gonna get the bottom cooked. You've got to remove the beans, but you need the beans in order to get this outer shell set so that we don't have a collapsed pie. Okay, I'm still gonna go back on the 300 degrees on bake roast. I'm gonna set the clock for 15 minutes and I'm gonna keep an eye on it, and when it's done, I'm gonna end up turning this into a delicious apple pie, so I don't want the edges to be too brown. So I'm gonna take it out a little bit earlier than I would if I was gonna put a cold filling in. So just know that you can continue cooking as long as you want until you get the desired brownness on the crust. And if for some reason you get too much brownness on the crust and you want to bake it again after you add your filling, just use some foil or a pie guard and put it around the edges, and that will help prevent the edges from burning for you. Oh, it looks good. I'm gonna bring it out just so you guys can get a better look at it. I think that for my purposes, I'm done now, okay? This would be kind of a par cook. But because I'm going to add a filling to it and bake it again or air crisp it, because I haven't decided yet, I want to make sure I don't over brown these edges. And some of them are a little bit browner than others. No worries whatsoever. We can always cover these up a little bit. But it looks simply wonderful. It's definitely done enough on the bottom here. I'll tilt it up a little bit for you. And it's got some browning and it didn't puff up that much. So I'm really pleased with this. Now, before you put any type of filling into it, I would suggest letting it cool. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do while I move on to make my delicious apple pie filling. So I'm gonna let it come to room temperature. If you're adding cold, like a cold filling, that's just like a refrigerator pie, you would want this to be chilled before you add that in. So there's no chance of that cold filling getting warm. All right, there you have it. It is super easy to make your own pie dough at home and then use the blind baking technique in the Ninja Foodi to create a beautiful crust that you can fill with all kinds of fillings, from sweet to savory. This is your go-to crust.